Okay, let's open a word of prayer. Lord, thank you for this day. We pray that you will give us a spirit of confidence, not the spirit of fear, as we face the days ahead. Bless our time together today. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, today I'm going to, I was asked to do sort of a review of 2021 and a preview of 2022. I think it was last year, maybe it was 2 years ago. It's hard to remember because the last 2 years have kind of mushed together. But I remember, I'm not sure why excuse me one second here. I'm going to exit out so my title slide actually looks like a title slide. There we go. I think it was last year, the first time I talked. I was sick the first 2 weeks of the year last year, and I think I mentioned in my first update of the year that, you know, how far are we going to get into 2021 before we wish we were back in 2020? And I think, so that's why I titled this today, Oh, for the Good Old Days of 2021. We're 2 days into 2022. I looked at a lot of different forecasts, prognostications. I'll share some of those with you today. Some I didn't have time to share with you, but I'll talk about, or I didn't have time to make up slides. I didn't find a lot of optimism anywhere that I looked. It seems that, well, here's just the usual intro. Here are some of the places that you can find us. I'm still posting on Facebook and Twitter, but I'm moving over to Getter and Telegram a little bit more. I haven't posted there much other than links to the updates. I think on Getter, I'm John Haller 54, and I'm John_Haller on Telegram. I think that Twitter and Facebook are superior platforms, but they have these crazy rules, and you never know when you're going to violate them, and they just sort of randomly select people, it seems. It's been a while since I've been disciplined by, well, I shouldn't say that, because if I say it, then they'll come looking for me. So we talk each week about the convergence of events, and it's interesting in this convergence of events. I will touch a little bit on this transhumanism thing. And you know, from having Patrick Wood and some others here at Fellowship Bible Chapel and then the Adult Bible Fellowship that I used to teach at another church, we've been talking about transhumanism and how this works. And one of our friends wrote a book called Building the Kingdom of God on Earth. It was a study of what globalists were doing back in the late 1800s to about 1930, particularly the Dulles brothers and others. And that's what is going on here. There's two competing systems always in the Bible. You have Babylon, which was the first rebellion against God on a global scale. Man tried to make themselves of God. And then you have the redeemed people of God, whether through Israel, the church, and those things, and how there's sort of this tension and conflict. And at the end, it's going to point to, there's going to be a period of time given to this Babylon system, Babylon kingdom, beast system for a period of time at the end. But then the millennial kingdom of Christ will come, and then eternity. But there's this tension between the two. And what we're seeing in this transhumanist and artificial intelligence movement is a group of people who think that they've got it all figured out, and they won't say it, that they're trying to create God. For example, I heard an interview this week, or somebody talking about transhuman this week, and Ray Kurzweil was asked a question. Now, Ray Kurzweil is the head of the Singularity. He thinks that this man and machine and artificial intelligence are all going to merge into the singularity. And he's doing it for religious purpose. And someone wants to ask him, have you created God? And his answer was, not yet. And I think that tells you where this is going. And so when we talk about this convergence, the convergence is the battle between the two. And it is, at its core, it is a spiritual battle, and it's going to continue. And so I try to simplify it and talk about it in terms of ACLU: acceleration, convergence, logistics, and understanding. Knowing that as we get closer to the end, we're going to have a better understanding of how all of these things work out. And believe me, I've watch other people's updates. I watch, people who teach on Bible prophecy and that type of thing. And I'll be honest with you, people are all over the place. Everybody's got their system and they've got it all figured out. And I see people, some of them I think are even friends of mine on Facebook, are constantly trying to set dates. And it just doesn't work. I remember one person I talked to extensively, he's just sort of disappeared from YouTube because he had set so many dates about the rapture and when all this was going to end. I think he just kind of went off into something else and figured he'd blown it. And he had. And I would caution him about you can't set dates, and you just can't be hanging out there by yourself saying this is that which was prophesied. That's a very dangerous place to be. So as we get closer to the end, the wise will understand and instruct many. And I think that we need to be talking among ourselves, among believers, about people who love Bible prophecy, having discussions at a high level about what's going on. So that's why I do this Prophecy Roundtable. I don't agree with the guys on Prophecy Roundtable. By the way, if you want to watch that, it's Doug Hamp and Scott Harwell, and then we usually, a lot of times we'll have somebody come in. We don't agree on everything, so don't go in there and say, well, John Haller agrees with everything that Doug Hamp says. No, and Doug Hamp doesn't agree with everything John Haller says, and that's that type of thing. We're friends, we get along. But I think we're at this period of time where, a lot of these ideas that have been floating around are kind of coming to the fore, but we need to be talking about them. And I also think that things that we really haven't been talking about in the body of Christ, we get kind of our pat system, and then if it doesn't fit in our system, then it's not worthy of discussion. But I think we need to figure out what fits within the Bible framework and not our own thinking. So let's take a look at, and so understand that when these Bible prophecies are actually fulfilled, they will happen in a real world. And it could be our world. It certainly seems like it is our world. And these things, though, when they start happening, just like the Bible prophecies that were related to Jesus' first coming, a lot of them were fulfilled in that last week of leading up to his entrance into Jerusalem, to his crucifixion and resurrection. You're going to see that happen before the second coming of Christ. There's going to be this acceleration and convergence. It's going to happen quickly. And we just need to be open to that. So there's all these people are prognosticating about what is going to happen in 2022. Here's The Economist, as one commentator calls it, the tip sheet, one of the tip sheets for the party of Davos, the globalists, the transhumanists, and what they want to see. And you can see they always sort of give you tips. And here's, there's the microscope, there's implying DNA, there's the wind turbine, there's vaccines, there's Xi from China and the US, and they're implying that there's going to be a conflict. It's not much of a prognostication because there is a big conflict between the US and China. I think this ship, though, if you wanted to summarize 2021, this sort of was the symbol of 2021 in many respects, in that it got stuck in the Suez Canal for about a week. It cost billions of dollars in missed shipments and late shipments as ships had to back out, turn around in the canal and then go down around the Horn of Africa to get to their cargoes to market. They held this ship for months and months because they wanted a couple $2 billion in damages for delayed shipments. And this is just sort of symbolic. This is from an Austrian newspaper that I saw this morning. And the translation of that headline there is, and so Austria is going through these rather severe lockdowns because of the Charlie Vector 019er. That's the virus. I should explain that. Somebody asked me last week, when you say Charlie Vector 019er, what are you talking about? And I'm talking about the thing that I'm not allowed to talk about, that spiky thing there, Charlie Vector 019er. So that's the thing I'm not supposed to talk about. And then, of course, the state-approved treatment is, the other thing that you're not really supposed to talk about. So those are code words that I used for these things. But this is the headline from this Austrian paper this morning. The outlook for the new year is not very encouraging, but we can still marvel at life. The Financial Times, another paper that's often referred to as one of the tip sheets for the party of Davos. This is what they think is going to happen in 2022. You see Macron and Marine Le Pen. There's a big election in France this year. Their prognostication, by the way, at the Financial Times is that Macron will eventually prevail. You see China, you see Putin, you see Boris Johnson, who's having trouble, and then over there to the right, you see that there's even more trouble. The world is just having these problems, and then you see this building at the upper right, which is representative of the United States, which they think is going to have problems, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. And then, of course, electric cars, because once we get an electric car, then pollution will cease. And they also have, you can see down here in the zero, they also have Charlie Vector, the state-approved treatment for Charlie Vector 019er. They have that picture there. So there's just a lot of prognostications. Let me cover this first, since this has been a big deal. Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted this week on, I think, 5 of 6 counts. She faces up to 65 years in prison. I don't think she'd get 65 years. She could get, they always do it in federal system, they always do it in terms of months, and then there are enhancements and levels of enhancement. But, a lot of people are saying, well, she's going to talk now. She's going to talk and tell all, and she's going to get a reduced sentence. But she's been in the crosshairs of the feds for 5 years. She hasn't talked yet. She's not likely to talk. I think that's a pipe dream. It's possible, but at this point, she's convicted. If she wanted a deal, she should have talked earlier. But understand, in the federal system, the way the prosecutors think is there are some people, when they're involved in one of these big trials and scandals and criminal matters, they don't even talk to you about a deal sometimes, because they want to get their big fish. So the lead prosecutor in this was former FBI Director James Comey's daughter. So they got a conviction on 5 of the 6 counts. The 6th count was pretty weak anyway. And then, of course, Duke, Prince Andrew was caught up in this, and the question is, what's going to happen to him? My thinking is that it's going to be very difficult to make the case against him because of some credibility problems. And these are always very, very difficult cases to investigate and prosecute, because especially these which happen now, a lot of these allegations relate to things that happened up to 20 years ago, and memories just are not that good. This is from the Washington Post this morning, Outlook, the year in preview, and some of the things that they're talking about. So one of the things they talk about that they think is a big deal is global warming. And so this is one of the big narratives. Back in the fall, I think it was in November, that the World Economic Forum, who had spent a couple of years talking about the Great Reset and this website that they put up called Strategic Intelligence. And you should go and look and peruse through it because they keep putting things there. It's one of the most incredibly organized, layered websites I've ever seen. I talked about that first, I think, on April 1st, 2020 in an update, a midweek update that I did. And so there's this narrative about global warming. So they've got, the Charlie Vector thing that they've got everybody fear about now that it's going to be global warming. And I personally believe that a lot of the control freaks that have put things in place regarding Charlie Vector, they're saying, we didn't even have to pass the laws. We just made up an emergency and we were able to control everything and lock it down and change the economy and print money. It was easy. We got away with it. So why are they going to do that for global warming? Because if you look at the New York Times, I'll talk about it either during the week or next Sunday, their review section, that's the opinion section of the New York Times on Sunday, it is all about world on fire. And it's about 8 pages of graphics and pictures about how everything in the world is falling apart because of global warming. Because I think they've milked Charlie Vector about as much as they can, so now they got to move on to the next crisis to control everything. And they're moving it forward. Now, listen, well, I'll just say it right now because I don't remember if I'll remember when I get to it. We have a big election this year in the United States, midterm elections for the House and Senate. By all estimates, the Republicans should do well in that election. But listen, we're what, 11 months and 6 days, I think, away from the election. I think it's November 8th. A lot can change in 11 months or 10 months. I guess it's 10 months. Yeah, 10 months. Listen, so don't say it's a done deal because it's a battle, and it's going to be a battle like you've never seen. But as the polling gets better for Republicans and worse for the Biden administration and their press secretary, who I've now renamed Cruella von Zuckerberger, as the polling gets worse, they're going to look for ways to control the vote. And it's going to be part of the narrative. And I suspect, my suspicion is that it may come down to they need to flip, a certain percentage of people. And they're going to say, well, a certain percentage of people refuse to get the state-approved treatment for Charlie Vector 019er, and we're going to require that state-approved treatment in order to vote. Now, that's my suspicion. I could be wrong. That's my prognostication. Because they're going to be desperate for some way to get a big chunk of voters out of the mix. And all at the same time, the narrative will be that it's the Republicans who are trying to keep voters out of the mix. Because every time a Republican puts in a rule to make sure that the election is secure, what do they say? You're taking away our rights to vote and that type of thing. So because it's the narrative, and you understand that if the people are on the left, if their lips are moving, 99% they're lying. That's just a good thing. I mean, Republicans lie like crazy too, but I'm just telling you, on the left, it's a pretty easy determination. So one of the things, this thing that happened in Denver this week. These have been kind of strange storms that we've had, tornadoes in December. And then this was the result of dry conditions, but the wind gusts came down out of the mountains at anywhere from 100 to up to 120. I even heard 160 miles per hour. Ripped down some power lines between Denver and Boulder around, I don't know what they call it there, Louisville and Superior, Colorado, there along Route 36, and snapped the power lines. They caught on fire, and the scenes are just up to 991 houses were destroyed in just a very short period of time. The pictures are just absolutely incredible. In fact, there's to give you an idea of this, there's I had a video of this. Which I didn't put in. I'll turn the sound down and I'll talk about, this is a picture of around Louisville, Superior, Colorado. I mean, whole neighborhood's just gone. I saw an interview with a lady. She had a business and a strip center in this area. Her business was gone. Close friends of hers had just opened a restaurant 2 weeks ago. It's gone. And I mean, these people, they don't have anything left. It hit strip centers, it hit homes. Now there's word that 2 or 3 people are missing and presumed dead. They didn't think there were any. And the amazing thing was there were no casualties. But friends of mine who lived sort of in that area, they were driving through there and you could hardly stand it because of the smoke. So I just think that these things are going to become a little bit more common. It's going to be attributed to global warming in many respects. But the other thing that we need to keep in the mix is that some of this might be the judgment of God. And my concern is that what man is doing is man is setting up an explanation to explain away God's judgment. And so now when you talk about it as the judgment of God, I've even had Christians say, oh, God wouldn't judge us. Well, why? Really? Why wouldn't he? So just, I mean, look at this poor, I mean, yeah. It's just, I saw one home, the only thing that was left was the person's smoker. That's the only thing. I mean, everything else was just totally ash. Even the National and the United Arab Emirates picked this up. Pictures of this, just incredible. And so we're going to control global warming. We're going to do renewables. That's going to be the solution to everything. I saw a picture today of a solar panel array in a field. Oh, now the problem in Colorado is everything's covered with snow now. They had a snowstorm. And guess what the snowstorm did? It covered up these big fields of solar panels. Well, solar panels covered with snow don't do anything. And in Germany, they've got it all figured out. Everything went so well. They didn't learn from Texas. They've closed down their last nuclear reactors now in Germany. And I think I agree with Dennis Prager, who says if somebody's not as serious about fighting global warming, they would be in favor of nuclear energy. But of course, this person says, well, nuclear energy produces a lot of carbon dioxide too. But you need electricity for all your electric cars. And you need the mining. There's a graphic out there. Where did I see that? I saw a graphic this morning of a lithium mine in Argentina and how it's grown over the last 8 years. It's unbelievable. Why? Because they need lithium for batteries and electronics. And that mining causes CO2 emissions, but that's okay because it's an electric car which emits zero if you don't consider the fact that they have to use a coal-powered power plant or nuclear plant to charge the thing up. The other thing that they're talking about, and this is kind of one of the narratives that's going to be a big deal this year, is the conflict between Republicans and Democrats in the U.S. And you're going to see the same thing in France because of the election that went on, or that's going to go on this year. And it'll be bitterly fought. This will be bad. And so one of the things you're going to see is narratives. Now, I found this interesting. I sometimes get comic relief by watching certain people on TV. We know that Elon Musk was selected as Time's Person of the Year, and that upset Joy Reid he criticized Senator Elizabeth Warren, Pocahontas, as we like to refer to her around here, who said he needed to pay more in taxes. And he said, listen, Senator Karen, I've paid $11 billion in taxes in 2021. What do you want? And then she said, well, you're just a freeloader. So it was bad. It was very high elevation of discussion back and forth. And here's Joy Reid's assessment as she selects, well, you'll see what she does.
Elon wasn't happy, so he did what he always did and stomped his little feet and insulted Senator Warren, calling her an angry mom and referring to her as Senator Karen. So for so many reasons, being a freeloader and a selfish and disrespectful one, and for misappropriating Black vernacular for misogynistic purposes, Elon Musk is the absolute worst. Meanwhile, Senator Warren has better things to do than fight with Junior Birdman on Twitter.
Okay, so now the one thing that somebody pointed out and I thought was pretty astute is, so Joy Reid is going after Elon Musk, right? So I guess now it's okay to criticize successful African Americans. Elon Musk is from South Africa and he lives in America now. So he's an African American, right? Get it? A little subtle. Think about it a little bit. But one of the things you're going to see is this narrative that's going to be, and it's all going to relate to the events that happened on a day in January in the United States, in Washington, D.C., a year ago, just about a year ago. And you're going to be inundated with this. Everywhere I look today in the mainstream media, there were stories about this. These are two covers from The Economist, one from the middle of the year, and then one from just this week. And you see what it is. The elephant obviously represents one party in the United States, and that's the risk to American democracy. This is a narrative. And then here's the graphic that they have, and you see how the elephant is pulling out the pillars of American democracy. This is from the Times of London this morning. A year after the riot, the specter of civil war haunts America. This is just overwrought. Has anything happened? Look, there were bad things that happened that day. People need to go to jail for that. I agree with that. But I'm troubled. So here's Newsweek's cover, Trump troubles, and their lead article, The Armed Uprising of 2024. How many weapons, like guns, were confiscated from people who were engaged in what happened in January of last year in Washington, D.C.?
0.
Do you know? 0. Now, they used some things as weapons. Admittedly, people were hurt. Here's another graphic in that article. Do you see and so this is the psychology thing that you're going to be, this narrative is going to be shoved down your throat, shoved in your face all year. Here's the Washington Post this week, an editorial by military generals who are saying, on the right, the military must prepare for a 2024 insurrection. You see, they're already creating the narrative. They created the narrative before the last with the Transition Integrity Project that talked about what would happen. So, understand there's things we should not countenance that happen, but there are people, I know people who were just in Washington, D.C. that day that have been drug in and interviewed by the FBI. They weren't even near the Capitol. They were blocks away. So it's crazy. There's also these reports in the left-hand column. There's this article, Semper Why at Mandate. What's happened is, and so the generals in the Washington Post, they talk about this. We need to clean up our military and get these people out of our military. And I personally believe one of the ways that they did this was they put in a mandate for the state-approved treatment for Charlie Vector 019er. A certain number, I've heard of 2,000-3,000 Marines have refused. They've already discharged close to a couple hundred, 200 or 300 of them. There were thousands of religious exemption requests submitted in the armed forces of the United States. To my knowledge, as particularly in the Marines, every single one was denied. Why did they do that? They did that to identify and then purge the military. And so you had these woke lunatics running the military and the Department of Defense at a time when the world is really at the precipice of war. And we're turning our military into woke people. They have in the Department of Defense now, I think they're called gender transition officers in the military. This is, look, if it's not the end times, then people need to stop making it the end times. And so here's this thing. All Marines were denied their exemption, religious exemption. 3,080 have been processed and denied, Marine Corps spokesman Captain Ryan Bruce told the New York Post. The other thing you're going to see are continuing conflicts at the school board level. This is also from the Washington Post this morning, because of critical race theory. And they're going to say, we don't teach critical race theory. You teach the praxis, the way to implement the concept of critical race theory. You don't think that's true? Wait till we get to the discussion of Omicron in just a moment. Here's an interesting thing that happened. Now, I talked about this last week, J.K. Rowling, and I'm no fan of Harry Potter, but she's a multi-billionaire from that book, and she wrote, the series. It was turned into movies. She made a lot of money, but she came out and she liked a tweet of someone who was critical of people referring to a transgender as a woman, a real woman, or a woman who menstruates, or a transgender who can give birth. This is like this is, as J.K. Rowling says, it's just delusional, and I'm a woman and I'm not going to put up with it. And so we have these fictions now I saw a picture of the University of Pennsylvania swim team today, all these female swimmers, and then this one giant one in the back, which was the guy he went through a year of hormone suppression therapy, yeah, but you didn't reverse puberty. You remember, when I was in 6th grade, I was the tallest guy in my class. We had 4 or 5 girls in the class who were like 5 or 6 inches taller than me. I mean, they were big. And now they're not, okay, because of the way men and women develop as a general rule. But J.K. Rowling, they had a reunion of the Harry Potter movie people, and she wasn't invited. The one who created the series that made them all wealthy beyond what they deserve, they didn't invite the creator. Because why? Because she's not woke, she's not politically correct. And so I think it was The Guardian or The Telegraph, had a poll this year in Britain, vote for Person of the Year. And guess who was winning? J.K. Rowling. Well, we can't have that. So if you go to the poll page now, you see this. This form has been deactivated and is closed to any further submissions. And so they will not select a person this year because the person that everybody in the majority or the plurality in the UK thought should be Person of the Year is not politically correct, so she's been canceled. It's crazy. Have this, and this is a sort of another from the Washington Times, inflation, which we're told is not really a problem. I heard an interview, I can't remember where, of the guy who heads up Goya Foods. They said, are you going to increase your prices? He said, yeah, 40% January 1st across the board. And yet somebody will tell us, well, the fact that there's inflation, that just proves how wonderful our policies are. That's Cruella von Zuckerberg's standard line. This from a magazine called The People in the UK, the year trending, top futurologists on what your world will look like in 2022. Didn't even know there was a futurologist. America loses its shine, cities go out of style, water becomes a luxury. That is some of this plays into Bible prophecy, I think. Political instability, new tech goes mainstream, robots take our jobs, electronic pets, more angst, gene intervention, and online education. Because online education worked so well last year. And then this Omicron thing comes along and we're implementing it. Now, the Department of Homeland Security, and some of the other guys who do updates have talked about this, and I've been researching this over the last few days. These are solicitations for funding, solicitations so that the DHS will fund you in a small business innovation program to help you develop certain things. And look at some of the things that they're going to come up with. You don't need to go down, just stay up at the top because I'm going to go through these. Streamlined airport check-in screening for limited mobility passengers. Well, that seems practical, right? That's not a bad thing. And some of these things have a practical side, but then there's the concern that there's a real sinister side to what our Department of Homeland Security is trying to do it. And I think the submissions end up here in January. Here's the next one. Automated artificial intelligence distress alerts and monitoring. Now, this is said to be done for the Coast Guard, but you can only imagine how these control freaks that we have in charge of agencies in our government are going to try to implement these things. Here's another one, broadband push-to-talk interoperability platform, because they want to be able to communicate better, which we want our people to communicate better. I mean, you just had the example of the Denver fires in Colorado this week. And it was hard for the people. That's always a problem in these disasters. That's what happened on 9/11. It was hard for people to communicate about what they were doing, where they were, who was in charge, and that sort of thing. So it's a good thing, I think, that they want to try to do that. But then the question becomes, what are they going to do with it when they get a little bit further? Here's another one. Next generation high performance, low cost semiconductor based spectroscopic personal radiation detectors. So that's, they say that this is to protect against diseased animals coming into the United States, which could really damage the herd, so to speak. And they've had swine flu problems in China. They had to kill off a substantial portion of the swine livestock. And that can be a problem. Here's another one, a step towards agnostic detection of biological hazards. And so, there's this tension always in these things is, you want your people in charge to be prepared for things, but you also don't want them to bring in the things that they say that they're prepared for. That can be a problem. Here's another one, mass fatality tracking system. Now, the example they use is the collapse of the tower, apartment tower, condo tower down in Miami Beach. That they were having trouble who was missing and who was not missing. They had trouble the other day in Denver. They couldn't find people because everybody just fled. And now people are trying to find their pets and their horse. I mean, there were dozens of horses out in that area that got out, and people are looking for their pets. And so, there's always this good side to things, the practical side, but then there's this tension with what do bad people do with it? And here's another one, wearable detector for aerosolized chemical threats. And in the context of what we've been going on for the last couple of years, that's kind of interesting. And then field forward detection platform for high consequence toxins. And from port side to pin side, low cost detection diagnostics for high consequence transboundary, this can only be written by a government person, transboundary or nationally reportable animal diseases, particularly those with zoonotic propensity. So that's an issue. And then this is from the Washington Post, is what's 2021 going to bring with regard to Charlie Vector? Their answer is probably more of the same. So we remember the most latest version of Charlie Vector can also be reconstituted to this. And I think that shows the response. I want to do one clarification correction, the Department of Corrections here at Fellowship Bible Chapel. I referred to this person last week who slapped a man on a Delta flight as a flight attendant. She was not a flight attendant, it turned out. I assumed, and I had not seen anything to indicate otherwise when I saw that early Sunday morning. Turns out she's a former Baywatch actress. So somebody who really should be in charge. She's been arrested, by the way. This is from Australia, Western Australia, CBH to mandate COVID jab. Now, what's that all about? Well, unless you receive the state-approved, if you are a farmer, you have planted your crop, you have fertilized your crop, you have maintained your crop, you have harvested your crop, you have dried your crop, you have loaded your crop into a truck to take it to the grain elevator, but you don't have the state-approved treatment for Charlie Vector 019er, you cannot get your crop to market. Now, what's the impact of that? So I have a friend who's a farmer, large farm, so I texted him, I said, hey, how many people, when you take your crop to market, do you encounter? And the answer was, physically, less than social distancing, 0. Everything is done mechanically. You pull your truck in, you dump your grain, your soybeans or your corn, and you pull out. They weigh, you weigh the truck on the way in, you weigh the truck on the way out, and then they electronically transfer you a ticket by email or text as to how much you're going to get paid for it. And then they'll transfer that money to your bank account. Never in contact with another person. So what is this about? Safety or control? I think that's pretty easy to find. So we saw these videos last year of Australia, the lockdowns, the police encountering people on the street for, I don't know, do you have a right to be out to get a cup of coffee? In major cities in Australia, and the answer was, well, that could never happen here, right? So here's a video from New York City, which is now required to go to a restaurant, you have to have the state-approved treatment. And here are the cops lined up. Look at what they all have in their hands. Like half a dozen zip ties tied to their belt or in their hands. And those are plastic handcuffs. And so now they're going to go into, I think this is a Burger King. And a lot of people don't know that this became effective this week in New York City by that lunatic Bill de Blasio. He's not even the mayor anymore. I don't know if it'll stay in place. And so here they are confronting a family and an 8-year-old kid who got very scared with the cops going. And then they're going to announce here in a second, hey, if you don't have this state-approved treatment for Charlie Vector 019er. We are considering you a trespasser, and if you don't leave, you cannot patronize this restaurant, and if you don't leave, you will be arrested for going into a Burger King. And it's pretty good. I know they have time to do this because there's no other crime in New York City right now, right? This is insanity, and here they are leading people away to the paddy wagon because they had the audacity to get a burger. So we talked about this tension that they're doing between, with critical race theory and that type of thing. So they always say, we don't teach critical race theory, but you implement it. How do you implement it? Well, here's New York City. New York City's prescription for inequity will consider race in drug allotment for Charlie Vector 019er. You think that's from the New York Post this morning, I think this morning or yesterday. And here I went and looked at the Department of Health in the state of New York. Prioritization of anti-SARS-CoV-2 monoclonal antibodies and oral rivals for the treatment of Charlie Vector 019er during times of resource limitations. By the way, there's reports from the Surgeon General of the state of Florida who said, listen, we have a lot of people that still have problems with the Delta variation of Charlie Vector 019er, and we want monoclonal antibodies. And the federal government has stopped all shipments. Why? Well, because there's no Delta anymore, it's all Omicron. But now they don't have much for the Omicron monoclonal antibodies, so they're limiting it. And in the great state of New York, which has used to have that moral paragon of virtue, Como for governor, and now has this lunatic unelected governor who succeeded office when he had to resign, says here on their page, here's a blown up version of it, non-white race or Hispanic Latino ethnicity should be considered a risk factor as longstanding systemic health and social inequities have contributed to an increased risk of severe illness and death from Charlie Vector 019er. You need to start digging in. I'm going to do a update on this. There is if you want the podcast I listened to this week that explains what's going on with the racial differences and inequities in a very logical, scientific fashion, message me, email me. My email is on the church website, fbchapel.com, and I'll send you a link to the podcast. And yeah, I think you should listen to it. It's an hour of some of the most intelligent discussion. Non-Christian people, they believe in evolution and that type of thing. I think they believe in evolution with regard to origins, not just evolution of what happens after, which I believe in too. But it's a very intelligent discussion. I think you should listen to it, and you should take to heart what they recommend, the steps that you should take to protect yourself. Talking about artificial intelligence, I talked about drones last week. This is from the Times of London this morning. Hey, if you don't feel safe, we don't have cops because they're all out sick. We don't have people at the hospital because they're out sick. And we're closing down wards and treatment and all this other stuff. And you may not be able to get a cop, but you can rent a drone now to follow you on your walk home at night. And you can just phone it up. Cost per hour is 100 pounds. So you can go take a walk in London, I guess, and have a drone follow you around. And I'm sure that information will all be kept confidential. Nobody at the government will ever look at it. But this is the artificial intelligence thing. This is where it's going. This is front page. And so we've always had this thing about abortion. And the Supreme Court's considering abortion, and I think they're personally going to say that states are going to have the ability to regulate abortion. I think that's what's going to be the outcome. Now, whether they'll say They'll completely overturn Roe. I don't know. By the way, the attorney who argued that case, pro-abortion attorney who argued that case, passed away this week. I hope she repented of that. Sarah Weddington. But one of the reasons you get abortion is because you have a child. They've told you that your child will have a birth defect. By the way, another podcast you should listen to. David Fiorazo, Stand Up for the Truth. I'm on there fairly regularly. I will be on January 20th again as we celebrate the first year anniversary of the Biden administration coming to power, the Biden regime anniversary. But he had on a father this week who talked about the treatment that his daughter had received in the hospital for Charlie Vector 019er. His daughter was, she might have been 19. She had Down syndrome. Her dad said this was the most, and if any of you have ever worked with Down syndrome children, you know that these children are special in ways that it's hard to describe. The way that they love people, they're just phenomenal people. And he said she would operate at a 10 to 14-year-old mental level. She was trying to get a license to drive a car, and she caught the virus. And they talked about her treatment in the hospital. Go to David Fiorazo's podcast. It was either Wednesday or Thursday, Stand Up for the Truth. Just Google Stand Up for the Truth. Or I think it's standupforthetruth.com is the website. I'm just telling you that it goes along with what I said last week, that over the last couple of years, there has been a shift in a certain profession in the United States that is just absolutely, it's unbelievable. The cruelty that's come into this and what happened to her, and she passed away. And I've had a number of other people contact me with similar things. So anyway, Down syndrome, we got to get abortion because we don't want to have a Down syndrome child. Go tell that to this father and mother who lost this child that they loved. It's the level of cruelty that comes out of abortion has affected the medical profession in many respects. It is a level of inhumanity that is hard to judge. Well, they've always said, well, there are other birth defects. We test you for birth defects. You're going to have a birth defect. You should have an abortion. So here this morning, a little bit of truth from the New York Times on the front page, below the fold on the right side. Tests predicting rare disorders in fetuses are usually wrong. What? How many children over the last 50 years have been aborted because of tests that were wrong? And I would dare say that you could talk to almost 100% of parents, and you would find that they never told them that the tests could be wrong. And so look at the things. DeGeorge syndrome, 81% wrong. IP36 deletion can cause seizures, muscle tonicity. Crew-Duchat syndrome, 80% wrong. Wolf-Hirschhorn syndrome can cause seizures, growth delays, and intellectual disability, 86% wrong. Prader-Willi and Engelmann syndromes happens 1 in 20,000 births, can cause seizures and an inability to control food consumption, 93% wrong. Somebody needs to sue the pants off of these people. You want to know how weird a world it is? That 2021 is going to be just like, or 2022 is going to be like 2021 and 2020, and maybe worse. Baby Kim in North Korea is predicting the end of chronic food shortages in North Korea, which he does every year. And you know how bad the shortage is in North Korea, the food shortage? Look at him. Look how much weight he's lost. His apocalypse, what do you call it, provision pack that he used to carry around his waistline is gone. Now, maybe he's just working out. I will say this. I think that 2021 was an unusual year in that it was a year that I believe was completely devoid of reports of the actual or imminent death of baby Kim. Usually there's about 6 reports a year. He's on his deathbed. He's died. They're transitioning power. And by the way, whatever happened to his sister? Anybody see her lately? It's very hard to figure out what's going on in the hermit kingdom of North Korea. I talked about this last week, that this is a research report from INSS about talking about the viability of one-state solution, different one-state models. They have different ones that they were talking about: unitary state, the Palestinian autonomy, a confederation. And the answer is they said none of them work. We have to go back to the two-state solution. And this is what the Biden administration is pushing. This is what the Trump peace plan pushed, whether we like to admit that or not. People warned the Trump administration, don't do that. They released it that day. Guess what hit? Same day, January 28th, 2020. Charlie Vector. Big problem. This is something that you need to pay attention to. This is a conference call between Xi and Putin recently, about a week and a half ago, where they're talking about their defense pact and how they're going to work together. I have some more comments about this. The rest of this is going to be sort of the eclectic view of the Middle East. There's a few things I want you to talk about. So Turkey's had these massive financial problems. The lira, just this week, the lira dropped precipitously. I mean, it went down to you're getting 18 Turkish lira to get $1. Used to be like 3 or 4. So that's a precipitous drop in the value of the lira. And so now we have these reports coming out of Turkey, and this is one of the, I think, opposition leaders. Erdogan's having massive political problems, but he's been able to convince the people, don't drop the lira, keep investing in the lira. And so the other reports are saying he's doing stuff that nobody thinks should work, and it probably won't work, but it's propped up the lira a little bit, and think the value of the lira actually went up. I talked about the Iranian simulating the attack on the Dimona reactor last week. This is an interesting story. This guy was the ambassador of Iran to Yemen. Now, it's said, though, that the Houthis, that's the Iranian-backed rebels in Yemen, that control a large portion of Yemen. In fact, if you look at this map, the purple area is the Houthi rebels, and they launch attacks on Saudi Arabia all the time. And they're also there along the Red Sea, which is a major shipping lane, because you go through the Red Sea and where do you end up? Suez Canal. And there's concerns that these Iranian-backed rebels with drones and missiles and that type of thing are in that area. And it's a major concern. There's a big choke point down here in the Gulf of Aden at the entrance to the Red Sea, between Djibouti, where there's a huge Chinese port, by the way. I've talked about that in the past, and Yemen. And the war has not gone well. Well, this guy, the Houthis didn't like him. Iran is wearing out its welcome in some places. Now, I think Iran's going to do something. And I look at the fact that Iran is wearing out its welcome to some extent in Syria, to some extent in Lebanon, and to some extent in Yemen, and to a large extent in Iraq. Although they were clever to get things changed around in Iraq this week. We'll talk more about that in a week or so. But so this guy, the Houthis wanted to get rid of him, and all of a sudden he's evacuated from Yemen to Tehran, and he dies. They say he died of COVID. And this is part of the problem with the Iranian regime. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about the Iranian threat because I think this is a big deal. And I've talked about in the past that the Iranian threat is very asymmetrical in that they're able to get a lot of bang for the buck with these drones and missiles. They can manufacture them. They're manufacturing them with Hezbollah in Lebanon, with Hamas in Lebanon, with Hamas in Gaza. And you would think, why can't they keep these parts from coming in? And so here in the New Yorker this week is an article. I would highly recommend that you go read about it, The Looming Threat of a Nuclear Crisis with Iran. And this article talks about the fact that we're negotiating with Iran, but Iran's demands just keep getting more and more extreme. Why? Well, because they've probably created more sophisticated and powerful centrifuge arrays to purify plutonium to get it to the place where they can use it in a nuclear weapon. And their breakout times have gone from a couple of years to a few months by most estimates. So the U.S. is negotiating with them like they're going to go backwards, which is kind of naive in the extreme. But listen to this, what this article says. This is the New Yorker, a left-wing magazine, pro-regime, pro-Biden regime, and all that. Malley, one of the people involved in negotiations, took on unprecedented urgency in November. We've seen Iran's nuclear program expand, he said, and we've seen Tehran become more belligerent, more bellicose in its regional activities. They are miscalculating and playing with fire. Well, where's the fire? The fire is usually where their missiles and that type of thing are landing and their drones. I don't see a lot in response. But listen to what this article says, which I think is perceptive. Talking about Iran, the stakes extend well beyond Iran. The world's nuclear order, already perilous, is now at risk of unraveling. Nuclear pacts hammered out in the last century are dated or fraying as the US, Russia, and China modernize their arsenals. The Pentagon estimates that China could have at least 1,000 bombs by 2030. Why is everybody using 2030? Basically, that's like a target, sustainable development goals and everything. The talks with Tehran are designed to prevent a 10th nation, the latest was North Korea, from getting the bomb. Saudi officials have also threatened to pursue the bomb if Iran obtains one. Kelsey Davenport of the Arms Control Association said, the broader nuclear order is in chaos. The collapse of the talks with Iran, Biden's first major diplomatic foray, would have consequences worldwide. And they're right. Without a return to the deal, a senior Department of State official said, it is more than plausible, possible, and maybe even probable that Iran will try to become a threshold nuclear state. The wild card in all of this is guess where? Or guess who? Israel. At the UN General Assembly, this was what Naftali Bennett had to say about Iranian nuclear weapons.
Iran's nuclear program has hit a watershed moment, and so has our tolerance. Words do not stop centrifuges from spinning. There are those in the world who seem to view Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons as an inevitable reality, as a done deal, or they've just become tired of hearing about it. Israel doesn't have that privilege. We cannot tire. We will not tire. Israel will not allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon. It was then when my government... Israel is on course to escape the fourth wave without a lockdown, without further harm to our economy. Israel's economy is growing. Unemployment is going down. I'm glad our actions have inspired other countries to follow with the booster. I want to thank the 38 countries, 38, who chose truth over lies and skipped the conference. And to those countries who chose to participate in this farce, well, I can only say, attacking Israel doesn't make you morally superior. Fighting the only democracy in the Middle East doesn't make you woke. Adopting cliches about Israel without even bothering to learn the basic facts, well, that's just plain lazy.
You know, this week, Desmond Tutu from South Africa died, and he was praised all over the place. The man was an absolute despicable Jew hater. He was awful. And I see it. I see people, I'll talk about it in a minute. Israel made some attacks in Syria this week, and some people, look at Israel making unprovoked attacks. Well, when you have a regime that said we're going to kill you, we have thousands of rockets, we're making more rockets, I don't think it's unprovoked to step in and stop that. We'll talk about this. So this article goes on, talks about how Trump withdrew from the JCPOA. And this article looks back, there was this article in the Jewish Chronicle in the UK that talked about covert attacks on Tehran. You should go look it up. It was a couple, 3 weeks ago. I'm trying to remember what date it was. They publish on Fridays, so it would have been a couple, I don't see the date on there. 3 December. Okay, so 4 weeks ago. Or 5 weeks ago. So listen, this is an excellent article. It talks about the different attacks that Israel has done over the years. And I went back and looked at one of the ones referenced in this article from the Jerusalem Post in November 30th of 2011, over 10 years ago now. A mysterious black rocks Isfahan, home to key Iranian nuclear facility, and the head of the Iranian nuclear program was killed in that strike. And we're coming up on the anniversary in a day or two of the assassination of Soleimani and the head of the Iranian Shiite militias in Iraq by the Trump administration 2 years ago near the Baghdad airport. So this is still going on. These attacks. You're gonna hear these missile things, and you still have this. You have this interesting problem of these Iranian drones. This is a game changer. Alma Research. I've shown you pictures of their report on Iranian drones. They had a seminar this week. Here's a few minutes of the seminar. One of which is the head of Alma, and Seth Fransman from the Jerusalem Post, one of the excellent analysts on this, and who also wrote a book on drones. So again, I've told you that this asymmetrical warfare and the way it fits in the Bible prophecy is that the asymmetrical warfare allows countries that are involved in it to punch way above their weight class. They're allowed to, they can do things that they really probably couldn't do just in a normal world. So the technology and everything is really flattening the field in many respects, which leads to instability. So here's a little bit on the drone seminar from Alma that took place this week. I guess it took place last week. Anyway.
Well, it depends who you ask. Okay. So yes, we published a report, an in-depth report about the UAV army of Hezbollah. Really around 50 pages that described where it is, the different types, what's the logic behind it, and eventually we received tons of questions about the amount in the hands of Hezbollah, though I think it's not their story. And everybody were asking, how did you evaluate that Hezbollah is holding 2,000 UAVs? Well, actually, when you look at the timeline, and we'll try to share, let me know if you can see this, understand that if Hezbollah had 200 UAV in 2006, in 2013, and around 50 in 2006, meaning that it succeeded to 4 times increase the amount of UAVs in its hands in only a few years. And then afterwards, we have seen more reports in 2016 that the amount is continuing to grow. We understand that to evaluate that today in the hands of Hezbollah 2,000 is not an imaginary number. Moreover, when we look at the array, the arsenal of the UAVs in the hands of Hezbollah and in the hands of the other proxies in the Middle East, when we look at the importance that the Iranians see to this project in Iran and elsewhere.
Thank you so much for having me today. It's a very important issue, and I'm glad to see that the UAVs and especially the Iranian drone program is starting to get a lot more attention, because it's certainly a program we're seeing that is a major threat to the region and is kind of exponentially growing in a way, and Iran is certainly putting a lot of spotlight on this. In terms of the book that I wrote, the last book I was writing was a book about the war against ISIS, and I spent a lot of time on the front line, especially in Iraq, especially with Kurdish Peshmerga in northern Iraq, covering the war against ISIS. And at the very end of the conflict, when the Iraqi army and federal police were going into Mosul and clearing ISIS street by street in this kind of, I think, 8-month battle to retake this major city, I spent some time there. And I remember being with the Iraqi federal police and soldiers, and the one thing that spooked them out, because they had a huge number of men under their command, they had like 50,000 men against really very few ISIS fighters, but what really scared them was the fact that they knew that ISIS had drones, and ISIS was able to rig a lot of drones during that conflict, and they were using them not only to carry out a bit of surveillance, but also to drop munitions onto armored vehicles and onto troops. So it was something that was strange, because here you have the Iraqi army, you have an 80 or 80 country coalition ostensibly supporting this massive operation. So more countries ever combined in the world history trying to just defeat this one terrorist group. And yet with all that, all those resources, somehow they didn't have air defense against this drone threat. There were nothing that these guys on the ground could do to stop the drones, and they couldn't have a way to detect them. So if they heard a buzzing noise, they just assumed, well, that must be an ISIS drone. It could be one of their own drones. So I was amazing to see this kind of chaos, and I think that piqued my interest a bit. And then when I was doing more reporting, especially in Israel, on defense technology, and realizing that like 1 out of every 3 or 4 stories had to do with something that was related to autonomous weapons or unmanned systems. So not just drones, but also communications, the digital army, also unmanned vehicles, unmanned vessels at sea. The whole nature of basically taking soldiers out of all these platforms and having the platforms do all sorts of things, scan buildings, give drone swarms, whatever it is, and also the fact that you need to be able to use radar and air defenses to detect these threats more and more. And I started to see the degree to which, Israel, which is obviously at the cutting edge, a really super high-tech country, startup nation, et cetera, et cetera. Also, Israel is a very nimble country in terms of procurement and putting new technology on the battlefield. I just noticed how much, this was a kind of undiscovered country. It's not that no one had ever written about drones before. There are books about the Predator drones and things like that. There's a book called Wired for War. It was just that I felt I wanted to read a book about the global arms race for drones, and the book didn't exist. So I felt like, okay, I have an opportunity here to go write it.
It's very interesting that that one of the things that sparked your motivation to write this was your exposure to the pioneering use of drones by the Sunni jihadists of ISIS, and they were really one of the first to use this weapon so effectively on the battlefields of the Middle East. And now I'd like to ask you about the Shiite radicals in Iran. And why did they decide to adopt UAV capabilities so early on in the 1980s?
This is interesting.
Well, it's interesting. So Iran was a pioneer in drone warfare early on, at the same period that Israel was also pioneering drones to defeat the Syrians in Lebanon. And Israel had been tinkering around with drones, since the late 70s and had really come into its own in the 80s with drones. And I think the United States, of course, as well as a country, was beginning to tinker around with them well. But there were a lot of programs out there that didn't really work. What's interesting about the Iranians is here you have a country that after the Islamic Revolution is in a bit of a chaos. And then all of a sudden it's plunged into this massive, vicious war against Iraq. And Iraq at the time was a very wealthy country with a pretty competent army. And they were using chemical weapons. This was a devastating war for Iran. And Iran, was sending child soldiers to the front line, human wave attacks. It was a total disaster for the country. And they also had a huge attrition rate in terms of the pilots because of the revolution, a lot of the loyal pilots that were related to the Shah's regime, some of them had left. Iran didn't have new parts for all their aircraft because they were flying American aircraft. And so they hit upon the idea that, wait, you don't need to build new F-15s, which you're not going to be able to build anyway. But we have, if you're Iran, they had a Bell helicopter factory. They had some of the know-how to build certain things. And in the end of the day, a drone in those days, we're just talking about a large model plane, a remote piloted vehicle, right? And the idea the Iranians had, which the Israelis had thought up and others had thought of, was the cool thing about drones is you can put a camera on it. You can fly it over enemy positions. If it gets shot down, that's okay. There's no pilot in it. If it doesn't get shot down, it can come back and deliver you film, or in the case of Israel, it was using real-time video and things, but in the case of the Iranians, it was film. And all of a sudden, they had in their hands and their disposal something that gave them a kind of instant air force, in a sense, of surveillance against an Iraqi army that I think was probably, superior to them in many ways in terms of its sophistication and all sorts of things. So the Iranian...
So he goes on to say that, look, in that Iran-Iraq war back in the 1980s from 81 to 89, there were 1 million men killed in that war. And the Iraqi army under Saddam Hussein Iraq is about 1/3 to 1/4 the population size of Iraq. And they held their own because they had the technological advantage. And they had a lot of officers in Iran that were killed in that war. So Iran now has not only a problem with the war, which they eventually were able to end in a not so great way for anybody. It was just sort of I think people just got tired of people dying and nothing being accomplished. So everybody withdrew, but Iran had lost thousands and thousands of soldiers and military leaders in that war. How are they going to reconstitute an air force? They had lost pilots and planes. Well, the drone was a simple way to do this. So you always see that they lost the war, but they did the technological thing. And this is one of the criticisms that is the Biden administration lodges against Israel. You guys keep attacking Iran, and they just improve the way that they're doing, so it's harder to attack them in the future. We need to do an agreement with them. And Israel's saying, go ahead and try and get the agreement with them, but we got to stop them in the meantime. And so for decades, you saw the report from November of 2011, the attack on the chief of the Iranian nuclear program was killed in a strike, probably done by the Mossad. There were others in 2011, if you go back and research it. And then we've seen a bunch over the last year or two. So there's this battle back and forth, but Iran is being clever in what they're doing. And you can see that with regard to Hezbollah, they've gone from 50 in 2006 unmanned aerial vehicles to about 2,000 today. And that can cause a lot of damage. Look at what ISIS was able to I played you the videos of the ISIS strikes, the drone strikes on ISIS that they used to do. And they would take drone videos, high definition drone videos of the suicide attacks on installations in Iraq and Syria. And they caused havoc for years there, a small force. And there were major armies fighting against them. So Seth get his book on drone wars. It's a brilliant book if you want to learn more about that. And this is what's happening in Yemen with the Houthis, they're able to do all of these attacks. And this is a report from CSIS. It's a think tank. You can look it up. And here's what it says in this report, the Iranian Houthi war against Saudi Arabia. Well, I thought this was a war in Yemen, but they're attacking in Saudi Arabia. And it says the number of Houthi attacks against predominantly civilian targets in Saudi Arabia doubled over the first 9 months of 2021 compared to the same period in 2020, according to new CSIS analysis. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Quds Force, and Lebanese Hezbollah have played a critical role in providing weapons, technology, training, and other assistance to the Yemen-based Houthis. In response, the United States should provide Saudi Arabia additional aid to defend the country against standoff attacks. And this is a problem, and this is the Iranian thing. And so understand, I showed you this thing last week. This is the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. I'm going to talk about this in just a moment. I'm going to cut to the end here. But this is the foundation. You see this sits in the center of the earth. It's this Islamic building. It has the Palestinian flag on it. But this is from Ayatollah Khomeini's website. And the foundation holding up the Dome of the Rock, one of their holiest sites, is the Iranian-backed Shia militias around the Middle East. And in Israel, Lebanon, Gaza, and Syria and Iraq. So this is a big deal. And now we have, and I think I showed you this last week also, this is Soleimani, who was killed 2 years ago. And you see the interesting Photoshop deal on the left picture where he's standing there next to the Western Wall, and his shadow is what he would say, or what Iran would say, is Palestine. So you got to look at these visual clues and then compare them to what it's talking about in Bible prophecy. And then this is this great editorial cartoon where they've gone from the slingshot to the missile. So this week there were, I will talk about this, and I'll talk about this now. It's a holiday weekend, right? The Buckeye game is over. Are there any players left on the team now, by the way? Or are they all opting out? This is just destroying college sports, in my opinion. This is that name, image, likeness thing. It's awful. I'm not going to go play football because I might get hurt. It used to be the point. At least the other guy. But Turkey has, this is from understandingwar.org, the Institute for the Study of War. Great article on Turkey in review and all the different places that Turkey is trying to project power around the Middle East. You see, as far as Afghanistan, they and Qatar are going to control 5 or 6 airports. Even though all the economic problems Turkey has, they're going to control this. Israel is also now being subjected to, from the UN Human Rights Council, now approved for funding by the UN back in May. This is the UN Human Rights Council building in Switzerland, which is like the creepiest ceiling I've ever seen. When Pam and I were home shopping for our first home, we went to a house in Indianapolis, and it had a ceiling that it was white, but it looked like this. It looked like stalactites. It looked like it was just ready to drop on top of you. It was, and they do it, and they do it there, and it's art. To us, it was just kind of ugly. But here's what they adopted a resolution back in May to have sort of an open investigation of Israel for war crimes. Caroline Glick had a very good conversation on her podcast this week with an Israeli attorney. It was funny at the beginning. They really got into it. I mean, they're really going back and forth with each other. And then Caroline says, "Oh, so you people listening on podcasts, this is one of my best friends." So this is, you see this when you walk around Jerusalem. You see these people all look like they're arguing and yelling at each other, and then they are, and then they walk into a cafe and have a cup of coffee together and talk about their family. So it's just sort of a cultural thing, I guess. And being a lawyer, it kind of helps. But this is what they're doing. And so here's what the thing says, and ensuring respect for international human rights law and international humanitarian law in the occupied Palestinian territory. And the point that Caroline and her attorney friend make in her podcast this week, you can go to carolineglick.com and get it's on YouTube, it's on Apple Podcasts, there's a bunch of ways to get it. They talk about the fact that this international law thing, it's not really a law. It's what everybody sort of agrees is the law. It's sort of like the mandates that come out. There's really no law supporting it. It's just what somebody thinks is a good idea, and then everybody acts like it's a law. And that's the way international law is. So they have this kind of open-funded attack on Israel. Everything Israel does is a war crime. And like I said, you even see people who I think are Christians, and they're being saying, oh, look at Israel. Israel is just, their unprovoked attack. And they did this. They attacked Latakia port, which is where it's in the really strongly controlled Assad area of Syria. It's where Russia has a major naval base and airport. And there was an attack on the port this week. And one of the reasons this happened was, this is from Aurora Intel, the open source intelligence person on Twitter that I would recommend you follow, 3 guys. And so remember all the attacks on shipping container ships and that type of thing last year? So there was sort of this like, we really can't do this. Israel's doing it to Iranian ships and Iran's doing it to Israeli ships, and nobody's taking credit for anything, but it's causing a problem. So now the Iranian ships, they used to go on the right. See how they used to go there along the coast? Now they go all the way up around Cyprus to get to the port in Latakia. And they're bringing missile parts in. And Israel knows this. They can identify the containers. And so this is a satellite image. You can see the smoke coming from the attacks that Israel made on the port. And how Israel does this is, at first, I wasn't too sure that Israel did this, but this is, a few years back, there was a missile attack on this Aleutian troop ship of Russia, and it was flying out of Syria. And you see how it made the loop around. Well, what the Israeli Air Force did, this is a Russian graphic that was made up. And people said, oh, no, Israel didn't do that. But what Israel did was they hung off the coast and they cloaked themselves with this Russian military transport. And as it flies off, then they're going to come in, they're going to fire their missiles and attack the port in Latakia or elsewhere. Well, what happened was the Syrians activated their Russian air defense systems, and they shot down the Russian plane, and I think 25 people were killed in that, because they were trying to shoot down the Israeli jets, but here's the Russian plane that got in the mix. And the report is that this week they did the same thing. There was a Russian military transport landing at the airport there near Latakia, and Israel cloaked, and as they were cloaked, then they were able to come in and fire missiles and destroy these containers at the port. This is Iran this week. They tried to launch missiles into space, but they failed. They needed to get up to 7,300 kilometers per hour. They were only able to get up, or they need to get to 7,600. They only got to 7,350, so they weren't able to get their satellites into orbit, but they'll keep trying. That's what they do. So here's a report on the IDF this year. These are some of the things that they've been able to accomplish. And remember back in May when that resolution was adopted by the Human Rights Council and now approved this last week by the UN General Assembly, by a majority, like 125 countries approved it, 8 opposed it, and 30-some abstained. They're going to fund this. It's an open-ended funding for this International Criminal Court thing, which is not a court. It's a political body to attack Israel. But back in May, when they had the conflict with Gaza, that's when they started this. So rockets get fired into Israel, Israel responds, and Israel gets investigated for a war crime. And it's never ending. It just shows what's happening. Okay, so I'm going to close with this because I'm over time. But this is important. And I'll talk more about this. So we know that and I've talked about this many times, there has been this push to build these ecumenical parks, a one world religion, Chrislam if you want. This is the architect's schematic of one in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. On the left is a mosque, in the center is a Jewish synagogue, and on the right is a Christian church. Ecumenical. This came out of the meeting in Dubai in early 2019 with the Pope and the Imam from Al-Azhar University in Cairo, the leading Shiite theological school in the world. And the Pope's gone and met with the leading Shiite cleric in the world down in Iraq. He did that, I don't know if it was this year or the year before. And here's a picture of some of the recent construction. So they're building this thing in Dubai. Now, I thought this was interesting because this is not the only place they're building these ecumenical things. By the way, here was one of the original, this is one of the other architects who did not get the building design for the Dubai Abrahamic House of Faith. But this is his schematic that he built that he put together for the same place. So this was the one that they eventually adopted. Here's what another architect did. And look at guess which one is the mosque? The one on the left, right, because it has the minaret, because it always has the highest thing. And it's interesting that design is very similar to the design of the control tower at the new Istanbul airport that Erdogan built, and which opened, I think, last year or late 2020, and is the largest airport in the world. You understand this? You understand this thing with Turkey and Iran and Bible prophecy. This is a big deal. And here you can actually see this has the crescent moon on it. So that was the mosque. Here's one that I showed you a few weeks ago. This is a Tri-Faith initiative on South 132nd Street in Omaha, Nebraska. A mosque, a synagogue, and a church. Look it up on Google. South 132nd Street and I think it's called Faith Drive. Just do Tri-Faith Initiative and you can find it on Google Maps. This is the House of One, which combines Jewish, Islam, and Christian in one building on Museum Island in Berlin, Germany. And there are a number of other of these. Now, I was researching this, so I just thought, because we always talk about the Temple Mount and what's going to happen, and what's this Antichrist temple, what's it going to be? Because we know there's a passage that Orthodox Jewish people that are associated with the Temple Mount site that, build a house for all mankind, a prayer for all mankind. And does this play into Bible prophecy in any way? So I'm going to lay out to you I'm going to show you some things I found on the Temple Mount, was it templemount.org? Hang on a second, I'll give you the URL. Yeah, templemount.org. And just do /Komsky, Komsky. And you will find this schematic, which is the Temple Mount. And there is the Dome of the Rock. To the south there is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And at the top is an architectural rendering in the top right-hand corner. I'll zoom in on this in just a moment. And then below is what it looks like from ground level and then from above. And you can clearly see this relates to the Dome of the Rock. And this is where Orthodox Jews, the ones that are probably going to be in charge of building a temple, this is where they think the temple stood. And there's archaeological evidence to support this conclusion. And it's interesting, we talk about the abomination of desolation. On that Temple Mount right now is the Dome of the Rock. And in the Dome of the Rock, around the center, I've shown you many pictures of this in the past, I've been in that building, are parts of the Quran. They're probably the oldest existing pieces of the Quran on the planet. They're painted on the walls around the interior, on the outside. And one of them explicitly says, God has no son. Now listen, ultimately that is the abomination. God has no son. Because it denies the person work of Jesus Christ. That's an abomination to the Lord. But it exists in that building. But here on TempleMount.org is this schematic by this architect. And here's a little zoom in of this. And you see it's an octagon building. And what he proposes is 8 wings coming out from the building. Well, what are those 8 wings? Now, this is interesting. And maybe people have talked about this. I've never seen anybody talk about this, so I'm not claiming that I'm the first one. I've never seen it before, and it could have happened, okay? But I think this is important when we put all of this into what's this thing going to be on the Temple Mount that Paul talks about, Jesus talks about, Daniel talks about, and it seems to be central. It happens in this final period of history. And it coincides with the Antichrist rise to power, who goes into the holy place and declares himself to be above all that is called God. Now I'm going to show you what this architect has determined is part of this Temple Mount. Look at the wings. We'll start on the right. Judaism. Go up. Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah. We don't support that. Then to the left, he has Islam. Then to the left, he has what? Islamic mysticism, Sufism. Then he has Christianity, continuing around counterclockwise, Christian mysticism. Then the next wing is Hinduism. Then the next wing is Hindu mysticism, Buddhism. Have any of you ever seen this before? I'm going to read just from his thing. It's called The Third Temple for All Humankind on the Temple Mountain of Jerusalem. Moses Komsky, architect. I believe he's Jewish. If he's not, he's certainly got all the names for it. The need to integrate economic, political, and cultural life of nations manifests itself clearer than ever in the modern world. This process is realized in the 2 major directions: under pressure, through power of one over another, and by free will as a brotherhood of people devoted to their common Father Creator. Now, does this sound like this squares with what the Pope and the head of the leading Sunni theological school in the world was doing in Dubai 3 years ago? The Abrahamic House of Faith. Does it sound like it squares a little bit with what Jared Kushner and Avi Berkowitz were trying to do with the Arab Accords and now their Arab Accords Peace Institute? And by the way, Jared Kushner has gone around the Middle East and raised $3 billion in funding for his investment organization just in the last month. The first direction is the oppression exercised by stronger nation over weaker one that destroys the way of life and spiritual values of the latter, or financial power expansion. He goes on, he talks about this certain success of the ecumenical movement has strengthened the basis for the creation of the common European market as the first step to national union on the grounds of the free will. In the recent half of the century, the goodwill dialogue of Christianity and Judaism has for the first time been possible. The whole rehabilitation of Judaism as a worldwide religion, acknowledgement of legality and equality of the 2 testaments, acknowledgement of Jesus as a great prophet by Israelites, and acknowledgement by some Christian theologians that Jesus was created by the Heavenly Father. All these give stimulus for mutual approaching of religions of Abraham origin, i.e. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and afterwards all monotheistic religions according to the saying, the one shepherd, creator, the one flock, mankind. So go to templemount.org/Komsky, Komsky, and you can read this. You can look at the thing. So here he says, the second group of measures possibly could strengthen the unanimity which begins to show in the practice of pilgrimage through creation in Jerusalem, a scientific and theological center of God cognition. The Council of Elders of Israel could possibly develop together with creative organizations of Christianity and Islam, and the state of Israel could put into reality the following programs to be carried out in Jerusalem. 1, the highest ecclesiastical academy of all three religions of Abraham origin. The world center of ecumenism movement. Scientific center of problems common to all mankind. The center of legislative basis perfection for new social relations of people using the experience and achievements of Israel's Galatia and jurisdictic norms of other nations, as well as move to Jerusalem some functions of UN organizations concerning humanitarian, elucidative, and charity activities. Creation of largest libraries, video libraries, computer centers, hotels, grounds for carrying out forums and conferences will complete the program of making Jerusalem a, ready? Spiritual capital of the world. The peak of these peacemaking efforts would be the erecting of the third temple belonging to the whole mankind on Temple Mountain in Jerusalem. And he says, we don't need to demolish the Dome of the Rock. We can just go ahead and build it. This is very interesting. The Dome of the Rock with the Holy Rock itself can serve as the foundation stone of the third temple, as it can easily grant the proper condition for placing the common altar, the sanctum sanctorum of unified religions. 8 sides of the cupolas may be treated as a basis for construction of prayer buildings of various monotheistic congregations according to their accepted orientation in relation to the altar. Judaism from the east, Christianity from the west, Islam from the north, Hinduism from the south. This is very interesting. Would you agree with me? This is an interesting article. Well, I'll talk about this more in the future. This is now look, a lot of people will say, well, this guy's just talking through his hat. You know, he doesn't know anything, but it sounds like he's been the architect of putting it all together. I'm just suggesting to you is that how many of these things do we need to have happen before we begin to say, okay, Lord, we need to get ready for your return? And even if you're going to die before his return, you still need to be ready anyway. Interesting times to be alive, and use these things as motivations for sharing the gospel. And I'm not making any resolution about shorter updates for this year. I don't think it's possible at this time. Sometimes I'll do a 2-hour interview with somebody during the week, and we'll talk, and I'll stop plenty of stuff on Sunday, because it's acceleration, convergence, logistics, and understanding. They're all coming together, I think. So let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for blessing us to live at this time of human history so that we can see that nothing going on in the world escapes your notice, that you are in control, and that we need to be about our Father's business, sharing the gospel, discipling others, being in the Word. Help us to always keep that at the front of our minds and hearts. Bless us this week in Jesus' name. Amen.